In the early 90s, Peru wasn't just a country in crisis, it was a nation in free fall, heading toward an abyss that seemed bottomless with hardly any way out. The economy had collapsed under the weight of a hyperinflation that exceeded 7,600% annually, a record figure. It was so enormous and absurd that it ended up turning a lifetime's effort into nothing more than handfuls of useless paper, mountains of bills that had completely lost their value. On the streets, the future was no longer a promise but a threat. Constant anguish settled in millions of families who could no longer even provide breakfast for their children. From one day to the next, the elderly watched with sadness as the country they built unraveled before their eyes, and for the young, even hope seemed to have lost its value. Alan Garcia's government had left behind a structural collapse that ended up eroding almost completely the foundations of the state, not just its credibility. International confidence had collapsed, and domestic confidence had shattered. It was no longer just the investors or businessmen who had stopped believing in Peru, but its own people as well. Hundreds of thousands chose to leave, and those who decided to stay or had no other choice but to stay resisted as best they could. In the markets, scarcity had become part of the routine. Money had stopped fulfilling its most basic function. Salaries would evaporate in a matter of days. There was no stability. There was no predictability, no guarantees either. And while the economy kept sinking further, violence continued to rise. Shining Path and the MRTA had managed to bring terror from rural areas to the main cities, taking the lives of more than 35,000 innocent people along the way, and making fear a permanent presence. Peru wasn't just in crisis, it was completely overwhelmed. It was in this context that the elections took place. The 1990 elections wouldn't just be another democratic process, but a historic crossroads. Peru wasn't just choosing a president, but choosing between two radically different paths that promised the same thing: to put an end to this nightmare. On one side, Mario Vargas Llosa appeared, leading the Democratic Front, or Fredemo, a coalition that brought together liberal, business, and much of the traditional political class. His proposal was clear and direct. Peru needed a drastic shock, an immediate economic adjustment program that would have an impact. Massive privatizations, elimination of subsidies, prices brought in line with real costs, and a complete opening to the international market. The writer insisted that there was no other way out. Hyperinflation had devastated the country so badly that only an extreme measure could stop the collapse and rebuild the economy from the ground up. It was a technically sound proposal, backed by economists and international organizations, but deeply feared by a population that no longer could bear more sacrifices. On the other hand, at the opposite end of the political spectrum, a figure began to emerge who, until a few months earlier, was practically unknown to the country. The name of the outsider was Alberto Fujimori, an agricultural engineer of Japanese descent, a university rector completely removed from traditional politics. He did not have a traditional party behind him, nor the support of the elites or the classic structures of power. And even so, his candidacy began to grow like a giant wave that no one saw coming. His message was much simpler and more emotionally powerful. Don't make the people suffer anymore. He offered a different path from his rival, talking about gradual measures, a less abrupt transition, and greater sensitivity to the daily suffering of millions of families. And he appeared closer to the people, distant from the technical and cold language of economists. The contest ended up becoming a clash of narratives. Llosa spoke of radical measures to rebuild the country. Fujimori, on the other hand, offered something that at that moment mattered much more: the feeling of relief. One appealed to reason and technical diagnosis, the other to the emotional exhaustion of a country that felt panic run through its body just by hearing the word shock again. His measures had been devastating, and Vargas Llosa's promised to be even worse. For millions of Peruvians, Alberto Fujimori represented the hope of avoiding another immediate blow to their wallets. Then, on June 10, 1990, he was elected president of Peru. What would come next would take the country by surprise, because once in power, Chino would quickly forget that message of gradualism that had carried him to victory, and would end up doing exactly what he had promised not to do. I'll explain why, how, and its meaning. Stay until the end and subscribe to support more stories. Let's begin. A few days after winning the elections, Alberto Fujimori announced at a press conference that he would travel to más historias como esta. Comencemos desde el inicio. Pocos días después de ganar las elecciones, Alberto Fujimori anunció en una conferencia de prensa que viajaría a Estados Unidos y luego a Japón. A simple vista, parecía una gira diplomática más, pero en realidad aquel viaje terminaría convirtiéndose en Japan. At first glance, it seemed that it becoming one of the most important turning points in the recent history of the country he was about to govern. The journey to that trip would end up becoming one of the original core of his party. In fact, Francisco Loaiza, Delmiro Montesinos, Carlos Orellana, his brothers, just a few more. Not even his own vice president, Máximo San Roman, was part of that small list. Fujimori was a deeply secretive and distrustful man. However, when Hernando de Soto requested a meeting with him, he agreed to meet with him. The consequences of that decision would be tremendous. At that time, Hernando de Soto was already an internationally renowned figure thanks to his book, The Other Path. In addition, he led the prestigious Institute for Liberty and Democracy, establishing himself as one of the most influential Peruvian intellectuals of the time. The meeting took place at Rosa Fujimori's house on Amazonas Street, a place that would later become known as the Bunker. There, Hernando de Soto would not present himself as a subordinate, but as a facilitator, a political operator with access to the centers of power. Proposal revolved around a central idea, the reintegration of Peru into the international financial system. After years of economic isolation, the country desperately needed to regain access to loans, financing, and foreign investment. Años de aislamiento económico, el país necesitaba desesperadamente reconectar. Terrorism, financiamiento, inversión extranjera, pero sobre todo recuperar la confianza. El mensaje de Soto era tan directo como pragmático. Tú tienes la legitimidad de los... Soto's message was as direct as it was pragmatic. You have the legitimacy of the vote. I have the contacts in power. The first step was to insist on meeting with a key figure in international diplomacy, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, the Peruvian, who at the time was Secretary General of the United Nations and who also had a close relationship with Hernando de Soto. His participation would be decisive, since at that time Peru was seen as an economically unviable, isolated, ineligible country expelled from international financial circles. After years of confrontation, and above all, because of the failure to pay the foreign debt, Fujimori had not even formally assumed the presidency yet. He needed legitimacy in the eyes of a world that seemed to be turning its back on him, and Pérez de Cuellar opened that door for him. Thanks to his mediation and his personal support, he was received in New York and Washington with a seriousness that few would have imagined just weeks before. On July 29, 1990, Pérez de Cuellar organized a meeting at the UN headquarters that would end up being crucial. Alberto Fujimori met with Michael Camdesus, director of the International Monetary Fund, with Barbe Conabol, president of the World Bank, and with Enrique Iglesias, president of the Inter-American Development Bank. Sitting in front of the most powerful men in the global financial system, Alberto Fujimori would receive a unanimous and relentless message. Peru had to abandon economic populism, apply fiscal discipline, eliminate subsidies, liberalize prices, privatize state-owned companies, resume servicing the external debt, and in this way reintegrate into the global order. In other words, he had to do exactly the opposite of what he had promised during his election campaign and betray the expectations of the popular sectors that had brought him to power. That meeting would mark the true birth of the Fujishock. Like what is often believed, this measure was not originally conceived by Alberto Fujimori and his small political circle, nor was it a carefully hidden strategy from the beginning to deceive the electorate and gain votes, nor was it simply a copy of Mario Vargas Llosa's economic program. It was, in fact, the result of enormous international pressure from the demands imposed by the men who controlled the keys to global. They were the ones who set the inevitable path for him to rescue Peru. They warned him that it was the only chance the country had to recover. And Fujimori, despite having defended a radically opposite position for months, decided to listen to them. In interviews given to New York media outlets, he began to hint that something was changing. He spoke about correcting Peru's international image, restoring international confidence, and prioritizing economic stabilization above any other political consideration, and adopting realistic solutions. even if that meant abandoning old rhetoric. The decision was quick, but not easy. The problem was that Alberto Fujimori was not the only one behind the unfeasible promise of no shock. Around him orbited the so-called Seven Samurai, a group of technical experts and economic advisors, many with heterodox leanings linked to moderate left-wing sectors, who had designed this alternative proposal. The nickname was born in the press as a reference to the Japanese origin of the new president and to the idea of a small strategic circle in charge of protecting and guiding him. The Seven Samurai were mainly made up of academics, linked to the National Agrarian University La Molina and the Pontifical Catholic U. Among its most prominent figures were Adolfo Figueroa and Santiago Roca, as well as technical support from Alejandro Toledo. Their economic vision was profoundly different from the one Fujimori had just heard in Washington and New York. They advocated for a gradual stabilization of the economy, greater state intervention, and protection of the national industry. Basically, a moderate extension of Alan Garcia's economic model. They had everything planned. They had even proposed the creation of a new currency called Amaru Real. However, after those meetings at the UN offices, Fujimori realized that the economic project of the Seven Samurai was totally incompatible with the requirements of the IMF and the World Bank. The organizations had been blunt. Those proposals had to be discarded. Otherwise, Peru would not receive any external financial support, and the truth was unavoidable. Without that lifeline, there was no way out of the hole. So with cold pragmatism, he discarded his advisor's proposal to embrace neoliberal orthodoxy. The shift was as abrupt as it was devastating, leading to the mass resignation of the economists. Heterodox economists who denounced Fujimori for adopting exactly the same cruel economic program he had so strongly criticized Mario Vargas Llosa for. Without a doubt, they were the first to experience the big shock. They felt betrayed, completely deceived. All of a sudden, those promises they had trusted in ended up thrown into the recycling bin on some desk in the United States. They had no other choice but to withdraw, leaving the field open for the liberal technocrats and unknowingly also for the National Intelligence Service. Because while all this was happening, Vladimiro Montesinos was quietly pulling the strings of power, adjusting them to fit the new scenarios that were beginning to emerge. From the shadows, he began to build the foundations of that parallel government that would end up defining the coming years. Vladimiro didn't understand a bit of economics, but he had an extraordinary ability to anticipate the course of events and detect where the real power was shifting, which would always allow him to infiltrate it. He quickly understood that this economic shift had dealt a deep blow to the president's own political base. After all, Cambio 90 was an improvised and fragile coalition made up of small business owners, evangelical groups, and popular sectors who had placed their trust in the promise of no shock. But by sidelining the original ideologues and breaking with the heterodox economists, Fujimori ended up without technical staff and practically without his own structure. That void would end up pushing him toward two pillars that would define the decade: external neoliberal advisors and the armed forces. Montesinos understood the new scenario immediately, and before anyone asked him, he was already taking care of everything. Meanwhile, Fujimori was securing much more than a ceremonial visit in Tokyo, and he would return to Peru with a seal of approval from the major financial organizations, thanks to the commitments made. During that June 1990 trip, there were four main ones. The first was the increase in tax collection. The goal sounded enormous. The Peruvian state was barely able to collect around 4% of the GDP. The intention was to triple that figure to reach 12%. To achieve this, Fujimori committed to eliminating tax exemptions, drastically raising the prices of gasoline and public services, and building a new structure capable of pursuing tax evasion. These measures would lay the groundwork for what, just a year later, would become SUNAT. If the Peruvian state wanted to survive, it had to professionalize tax collection. The second commitment was called privatization. Since the time of Juan Velasco Alvarado, the Peruvian state had become the owner of almost everything, from hotels and airlines to mines and telecommunications. The problem was that most of those more than 250 state-owned companies were operating with huge losses, and there was no more money to keep them going. The international reserves had evaporated. The state was bankrupt and had to stop acting like a business owner. The solution was clear. Sell a large part of those companies to the private sector. The third major commitment was to eliminate the MUC dollar, one of the biggest sources of corruption and disorder during Alan Garcia's government. In the country, there were two different prices for the dollar. One artificially cheap, subsidized by the state, which supposedly could be accessed by companies linked to priority imports. But in practice, a large part of those benefits ended up favoring businessmen close to those in power and groups with political influence, all at the cost of draining the central bank's reserves. Meanwhile, for the average citizen, there was another dollar, the real market dollar, which was immensely more expensive, the one that kept rising uncontrollably because of hyperinflation. The goal was to have a single exchange rate and allow the dollar to reflect its true value in the market. It was the end of an economic lie that the country could no longer sustain. The fourth commitment was perhaps the most important for achieving Peru's reintegration into the international financial system. If the country wanted to regain access to loans, it first had to resume payment of the foreign debt. Alberto Fujimori promised to resume the international obligations that Peru had suspended. From this decision came the idea to create a support group made up of friendly countries like the United States and Japan that would lend money to Peru so that it could catch up with the IMF, the World Bank, and its other creditors. A circular financial maneuver aimed at cleaning up the country's credit history and restoring its place within the global system. There were four commitments that had to be carried out quickly. There was no more time to lose. Alberto Fujimori took office as president on July 28, 1990, in a ceremony filled with tension and uncertainty. The opposition to his government was strong, and the fragility of his party was evident. The country was politically fractured, something that would soon lead to extremely radical measures. Alan Garcia delivered his final speech and handed the presidential sash to Máximo San Román, who finally placed it on the new president. The Fujimori era had officially begun before the expectant eyes of millions of Peruvians and in the company of his entire family. Everything seemed to be proceeding normally, but when he began to speak, the first big surprise arrived. In his inaugural speech, Fujimori began to distance himself sharply from the outgoing government, making it clear that he did not intend to shoulder Alan Garcia's political inheritance. He spoke of a devastated country, trapped in the worst economic and social crisis in its entire history.
A society divided by violence, corruption, terrorism, and drug trafficking. In a word, almost a war economy.
News from the Aprista caucus came immediately. The atmosphere became tense right away as many watched in disbelief at what was happening. After all, Alan had given Fujimori quiet but significant backing during the runoff. As we've seen in previous stories for the Aprista movement, any scenario was preferable to seeing Mario Vargas Llosa come to power, and Fujimori seemed like the ideal candidate for them, an inexperienced, weak politician, someone who could be easily influenced and controlled. As the speech went on, they realized they had miscalculated. Fujimori was being tough, distant, blunt, publicly dismantling the disaster of the outgoing government. He criticized the poor management of public companies, the paralysis of industry, the collapse of national production, and the state's inability to sustain the weight of its own structure.
We inherited a chaotic and exhausted economy. The inflationary epidemic has corroded every beginning of our productive system during the 5-year term of the outgoing government. This disastrous epidemic is reflected in the horrifying rate of more than 2,200,000, or 2,200% of accumulated inflation during the 5-year term of the outgoing government. We have inherited then a development. Thank you for the video.
His words were not rhetorical exaggerations. They were not hyperboles meant to dramatize the situation. It was a direct and well-founded criticism that he had not made until then. The first sign that something had changed. Until then, the Peruvian people were still unaware of the new plan that the president had brought from Washington, but it would only be a few days before they found out. On August 7, Alberto Fujimori declared a state of emergency for 30 days in Lima and 9 other provinces. Officially, the measure was in response to the increasingly dangerous advance of Shining Path and the MRTA. But later, many would interpret this decision as part of a larger strategy to consolidate control before the bombshell that would hit the next day. On August 8, 1990, just 11 days after the transfer of power, the history of Peru would take an unexpected turn. That morning at 9 o'clock sharp, an extensive session of the Council of Ministers began at the government palace, which would last until 7:30 in the evening. At the end, the Prime Minister and Minister of Economy, Juan Carlos Hurtado Miller, went to the studios of Panamericana Televisión, accompanied by almost the entire cabinet. Three ministers decided to step aside, refusing to support what they had just heard. They were not the only ones shocked. According to various testimonies, most of the ministers turned pale when they learned about the magnitude of the increases that were about to be announced. The figures sounded impossible. Hurtado Miller was direct with them. The social impact would be enormous, brutal and painful, but technically inevitable. No one wanted to be in his shoes at that moment. The Ministry of Economy had become a real hot potato that no one dared to touch. But Engineer Abro, an agronomist, agreed to take on that responsibility that night. Dressed in a dark suit and flanked by the Peruvian flag, he stood in front of the cameras, fully aware of what he was about to do. He would not merely announce an economic reform, but hand down a sentence that would unleash panic nationwide. And for many, it would mean the end. Around 9 p.m., the regular programming on all channels was suddenly interrupted. The screens went black. Oh! The national emblem appeared, and seconds later, Juan Carlos Hurtado Miller appeared to deliver a carefully crafted yet brutally direct 20-minute message. It was the beginning of a level of austerity the country had never known.
That the can of evaporated milk, which today costs 120,000 intis on the street, will cost 330,000 intis starting tomorrow. The kilo of white sugar, which could only be found at 150,000 intis, will cost 300,000 intis starting tomorrow. The French bread, which this afternoon cost 9,000 intis, will cost 25,000 intis starting tomorrow.
Finally, he ended the message with a prayer that would remain in the collective memory and become the symbol of that era.
May God help us.
There was no better way to sum up what was on everyone's mind once the message ended. Peruvians needed a miracle to survive the new Peru that had just begun. For a few moments, the entire country was paralyzed. People remained silent in front of their televisions, in restaurants, terminals, on public transportation. Even the cameramen and technicians in that Channel 5 studio were frozen in absolute silence after turning off the cameras. All of a sudden, as if by some dark magic, the money in their pockets had turned to dust. Subsidies for basic products like bread, milk, and pasta were completely eliminated. Prices tripled all of a sudden. In some cases, prices even increased 5-fold. But fuel was hit the hardest. Gasoline became 30 times more expensive. In a reality where even a small price increase can cause outrage and crisis, you can try to imagine what it meant to multiply its price by 30, the psychological impact. It came first and was devastating. If you were an adult when this happened, I'd love to read in the comments how you remember that moment. Your experience would be enriching both for me and for those who weren't born when this happened. I was very young at the time, not old enough to remember it. But my parents always told me about those days when life in Peru seemed like such a cruel horror series that its main victims ended up being the poorest. As soon as the announcement ended, army tanks and police patrols began to deploy along the main avenues, markets, and gas stations to prevent looting. Meanwhile, radio stations kept broadcasting desperate calls from people asking how they were going to survive this brutal price hike. On the buses, the fare collectors didn't know how much to charge. The uncertainty sparked heated negotiations on every corner. Many drivers simply made their passengers get off and park their vehicles, fearing they wouldn't be able to afford fuel the next day. Thousands of people had to walk for miles to get back home, carrying an anxiety that felt heavier than ever. The next morning, the country seemed different. Most stores pulled down their shutters. No one knew at what price to sell. Shopkeepers and store owners tried to recalculate prices amid the chaos, while desperate citizens knocked on their doors begging them to sell a can of milk or a kilo of rice at the previous day's price. That same morning, Hurtado Miller decided he had to follow his own advice. He felt that he really needed to ask God for help. Then the man who just a few hours earlier had set off the biggest economic bomb in Peru's history went out into the streets like any other citizen without suspecting what was about to happen to him. What happened to Hurtado Miller the morning after the shock is a story that I will tell in detail in a separate video. To stay on topic, this episode is already available in the premium section of the channel. You can join using the button below if you want to watch Hurtado Miller and what happened to him the day after the shock, along with more than 13 previously unreleased stories made with the same dedication. Also, by doing so, you would be greatly helping keep this channel going and helping to bring more stories like this one. That package of measures, which over time would become known as the Fujishock, struck Peru like lightning, reaching every corner. It wasn't the first one the population had faced, but this time it was different. Alan Garcia's shock packages were heterodox in nature. The prices of basic goods and fuel rose massively, but with subsidies, price controls, and wage increases still in place. These were desperate and contradictory measures that made no sense and solved nothing. They were nothing more than small patches trying to cover a giant wound, a naive attempt to put out a forest fire by throwing buckets of water. These only ended up fanning the flames even more. Fujimori's shock, on the other hand, was a real firebreak, an extreme measure willing to destroy everything in its path just to put out that fire, clinging to the hope that Peru would bloom again from the ashes. It was basically the demolition of the previous system to build a new one based on the free market. As had been demanded during that trip, the new government eliminated price controls as well as restrictions on imports. It unified the exchange rate, ending the MUC dollar, and also eliminated subsidies. After a long time, the Central Reserve Bank stopped allocating hundreds of millions of dollars that it actually didn't have to try to maintain the illusion of an artificial system that had already become completely unsustainable. The economy was abruptly brought into line with reality, and just as many feared, the beginning was devastating. The year 1990 ended with a 5% drop in GDP and annual inflation that reached extreme levels. Consumption plummeted with no money in people's pockets. Demand also disappeared overnight, and thousands of small and medium-sized businesses began to close their doors. With that came massive layoffs as well. That blow was not limited to the private sector. The state also began an internal purge of enormous proportions. Fujimori was determined to dismantle the gigantic bureaucracy that had been established during the years of Alan Garcia. Thousands of workers from ministries, public institutions, and state-owned companies lost their jobs. New hiring was practically frozen and salary increases stopped. The following months were a true descent into the abyss. The country was filled with strikes, protests, and growing social resistance. Terrorist attacks intensified, and tension within the armed forces began to worsen, especially after the retirement of high-ranking officials from the Navy and Air Force. Peru seemed to be entering a stage where everything could collapse at any moment. However, in the midst of all that chaos, something fundamental had changed. The printing press stopped. The state stopped printing money uncontrollably and stopped spending a single dollar that it hadn't previously collected. The country was still suffering, but the economic model seemed to be breathing again. It was time to take the next step: the privatization of state-owned companies. A point that ended up sparking internal conflicts within the government itself. On one side was the Council of Ministers led by Juan Carlos Hurtado Miller. On the other side was the Circle of Advisors to Alberto Fujimori, led by Hernando de Soto and his Institute for Liberty and Democracy. The problem went far beyond simple technical differences. The state urgently needed resources to cover the huge fiscal deficit. Hurtado Miller proposed immediate revenue measures, among them a 1% tax on bank transactions, popularly known as the check tax, in addition to other temporary taxes to try to finance that year's budget. The proposal sparked strong opposition among business sectors and the liberal circles surrounding the president. For them, the problem wasn't solved by raising taxes. The goal wasn't just to get money, but rather to reduce public spending and attract foreign investment. Selling state-owned companies was the only way. And in this dispute, Fujimori clearly leaned toward Hernando de Soto's position, not just out of political conviction, but because that was exactly the path required by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the international financial organizations with which Peru was trying to rebuild its credibility. That left Hurtado Milla in an increasingly untenable position until finally on February 14, 1991, just 6 months after his address to the nation, he submitted his resignation as Prime Minister and Minister of Economy. That resignation marked the end of the first stage of Alberto Fujimori's government and the beginning of a much more radical phase of reforms. The successor would be Carlos Bologna, more aligned with the Washington Consensus and the neoliberal ideas that were beginning to dominate the new direction. From that moment on, privatizations, economic liberalization, and the reduction of the state apparatus would stop being mere proposals and become state policy. And while this was taking shape, the political scene was rapidly deteriorating. The tension between the executive branch and the legislative and judicial branches was becoming increasingly dangerous. Fujimori began to publicly attack Congress, accusing the lawmakers of sabotaging the reforms and blocking national reconstruction. He called them jackals and crooks, claiming that they were not only undermining economic recovery but also the fight against terrorism at one of its most critical moments. This conflict, this collision between powers, would soon end up triggering a new story, one as decisive as it was controversial, worthy of another video.
Of the Congress of the Republic. Until the approval of a new organizational structure for the legislative branch, which will be approved through a national plebiscite.
Aware that he did not have a majority in Congress, and even less so after breaking his campaign promises, Fujimori began to consolidate a strategic alliance with the armed forces and the CIN. While the country was focused on survival, Vladimiro Montesinos was quietly gaining ground, power, influence, control. His networks grew at the same speed as chaos spread in Peru. Poverty advanced unchecked, trapping millions of families amid economic collapse, unemployment, and terrorism. And as if those misfortunes weren't enough, a new blow would hit the country: the cholera epidemic. What began as a health emergency soon turned into a real social earthquake. The health system collapsed quickly, exposing a brutal reality. Millions of Peruvians lived without access to the most basic services. More than 50% of households had no drinking water or sewer service. That precariousness combined with malnutrition had turned the country into a breeding ground, a perfect environment for the spread of the bacteria. Images began to multiply: overcrowded hospitals, long lines of sick people. Entire neighborhoods were declared under a health emergency. A new fear began to spread. The economic impact was also enormous. The state suffered multi-million-dollar losses. Meanwhile, different countries closed their borders to Peruvian products and restricted flights internally. The fishing industry, thousands of ceviche restaurants, and other seafood-related businesses were severely affected. They began to go bankrupt due to the widespread fear of consuming fish or seafood. There are times when you live and others when you simply survive. For Peru, the first half of 1991 was a time of collective agony. The years of the polycrisis, many don't even remember or can't explain how they managed to get through them alive. And maybe the answer is simple and harsh: pure survival instinct. The mothers in the community kitchens became true illusionists, multiplying bread and portions. The doctors improvised miracles with simple bags of salt and sugar. Meanwhile, millions of families spent the nights praying out loud so that the lights wouldn't go out, so that there would be something to buy at the market the next morning, so that the next car bomb wouldn't explode near home. For months, surviving became a routine. El 900, the country seemed to be doomed to a nightmare with no end in sight. Then suddenly something began to change. In the second half of that year, 1991, Peru, which had been plunging into the abyss for years, finally seemed to stop falling. At first, it was imperceptible, so slow that few managed to notice it. The change didn't immediately reach people's pockets or transform daily life. The first things to stabilize were the indicators. Inflation began to slow down. It dropped from an astronomical 7,650% annually in 1990 to approximately 139% in 1981, and then around 57% in 1982. It was still high. But for the first time in years, it stopped behaving like an out-of-control force. The economic reforms of Fujishock were stabilizing variables that for years had seemed impossible to control. The dollar stopped skyrocketing wildly against the national currency, the inti destroyed by hyperinflation. It was replaced on July 1, 1991 by the Nuevo Sol, giving back to commerce what it had lost. Predictability. People once again knew how much their money was worth. Little by little, national production also began to show signs of recovery, in growth of close to 5% in 1993. It still wasn't an economic miracle, much less a uniform recovery. While some sectors took advantage of the opening of markets and the arrival of new investments, others suffered from the competition from imports, the lack of credit, and the abrupt withdrawal of state support. The agricultural sector, for example, was one of the most affected after the liquidation of the Agricultural Bank. This left thousands of small producers exposed to bankruptcy. In mining, the initial collapse was dramatic. Giants like Centro Min and Hierro Peru were suffocated by the previous hyperinflation, and they were deprived of the budget for basic supplies. On top of that, there were prolonged workers' strikes. The mining sector suffered until the day it was privatized. Something similar happened with other sectors like telecommunications, energy and electricity, banking, rail transport, and air transport. Little by little, the economic apparatus built over decades began to change hands. But not everything was privatized. Some strategic institutions remained under public administration. That was the case with Sedapal, since it is a very sensitive service. A monopoly that many believed should be kept away from the private sector. Petro Peru was not sold either. The government had planned to do so. They proceeded with privatizing the La Pampilla refinery and several oil fields in the jungle and north. The company still survived as a state-owned entity. It kept the Talara refinery and the North Peruvian pipeline. Its continued existence was protected by a strong nationalist sentiment, both from the people and the armed forces. For its part, the Bank of the Nation was stripped of its commercial banking functions to avoid competing with the new private giants. However, the regime decided to keep it as the exclusive financial arm of the state, in charge of tax collection and payment to the public bureaucracy. In this way, the map of economic power in Peru was completely redesigned. The state gradually abandoned its role as a business operator to become a regulatory entity, leaving the fate of national development to the forces of the market. Formally, the state was still the owner of many resources and infrastructures, but it handed over their exploitation and maintenance to private companies. Through concessions that could last between 20 and 60 years, Peru fully entered a new economy. The set of measures known as the Fujishock, it managed to get the central bank to go from having negative international reserves to starting to accumulate positive balances rapidly. And in 1993, through a new constitution, it would be granted strict constitutional autonomy. It was explicitly prohibited from financing the public sector or printing money to cover government expenses. The money printing machine had finally been shut down. From that moment on, the central bank would have only one objective: to preserve monetary stability, that is, to control inflation. And it finally achieved it. After reaching absolutely uncontrolled levels in the early 90s, Peru began to enter a period of monetary stability it hadn't seen before. As the years went by, Peruvian inflation would end up becoming one of the lowest in the entire region. Something that, in the midst of the chaos and desperation of those years, it would have sounded completely impossible. But more than 3 decades have passed since then, and despite all the political crises that followed, we Peruvians never experienced hyperinflation again, capable of destroying our salaries. The national currency stopped being a piece of paper doomed to lose value every day. It became an anchor of stability. Perhaps the only one the country managed to keep amid decades of political turmoil. Thanks to that, millions of families regained that basic right that the previous government had taken away from them, the possibility of planning a future here. If you've ever wondered why, even today, a significant part of the country holds respect, gratitude, and even affection for the memory of Alberto Fujimori, to the point of placing their faith in someone just because they share his last name, this story represents the beginning of that answer. The economic recovery is just one of the many stories that marked his 10 years in power. There are other good ones, others very bad, and others are extremely dark, which we will soon be unraveling on this channel. If you want to see them soon, let me know in the comments. If a lot of you ask me, those will be the next ones. See you then. Goodbye.